My name's Darren and welcome to the Maker's Rage podcast. So today I wanted to talk about a short essay by Samuel Johnson called The Limitations of Human Achievement. And a short essay it is indeed. It will take me 5 minutes to read it, and I will be reading it, and then afterwards offer a short commentary in the context of his life and works, focusing specifically on this theme which crops up again and again in his work, of self-reproach for lack of application, for laziness, for laxity, a word Johnson knew well, and which the Greeks and Romans used to describe the kind of mental or spiritual sloth inured in the psyche of a person who spent too many years dabbling in irregular habits. We know this, of course, because of his essays, and through his many conversations with his friend and biographer James Boswell, and of course his own biographies, such as that of the poet Richard Savage, whose example illustrates how one can fail not through want of talent or opportunity, but through negligence, drunkenness, and squandering every chance of advancement that happened to come his way. A stark reminder that talent alone is no guarantee of success, and while poverty was certainly a hindrance in the beginning, he kept himself poor by not taking advantage of the many breaks he got in life, or of the support of his many notable acquaintances, including Johnson, who willed him to succeed. But as Johnson famously writes at the end of his biography of Savage, his example reminds us that nothing will supply the want of prudence, and that negligence and irregularity long continued will make knowledge useless, wit ridiculous, and genius contemptible. Now Johnson, of course, was extremely productive. The Dictionary of the English Language, published in 1755, was produced almost single-handedly, except for some clerical assistance where copyists helped him with the quotations he marked in books to illustrate the definitions he provided. And although he disdained the profession of dictionary making, famously defining the word lexicographer as a quote-unquote harmless drudge, considering himself first and foremost perhaps a man of letters, an essayist, a poet, fiction writer, he nevertheless poured himself into the work, which he projected would take 3 years but actually took 7, and for which he was paid 1,500 guineas, no mean sum in 1755. And after all, it was Johnson who said, "No man but a blockhead ever wrote except for money." Although in his biography of Johnson, Boswell qualifies this statement by saying, quote, "Numerous instances to refute this will occur to all who are vested in the history of literature." Now the piece I'll be reading is taken from the Idler, which was a periodical or collection of short essays modelled after The Spectator, which was made famous the previous generation by Addison, Steele, and Jonathan Swift, among others. But whereas The Spectator was famous for dealing with everyday quotidian themes in everyday colloquial language, or at least everyday and colloquial for the 18th century, one can imagine the young Johnson, who had an appetite for the highfalutin, getting bored by these topics and wanting to write about subjects of more interest to him like literature, philosophy, and some of the subjects that would have been tackled 200 years earlier by Michel de Montaigne, who famously invented the essay form. The word essay itself deriving from the French essayer, to attempt, to try, to give it a whirl, take a jab at, give it your best shot. It suggests something occasional, a throwaway, something you'd read then afterwards use as toilet paper. But of course, reading Montaigne, one is struck by his accessibility first, then his humour, then of course his erudition. His essays often interlarded with quotations from all the classics, and yet he never comes across as a pedant or a show-off. The legerity of his diction, his sense of humour, is evinced on every page, and I guess striking that balance is still the test for every essayist. The young Johnson must have thought that The Spectator perhaps went too far in the read and flush down the toilet direction, with essays on, for example, ghosts, courtship, witchcraft, company in a stagecoach, coffee houses, the cries of London, poor and public whores, not very elevated, but popular, and written by Addison and Steele, two of the great essayists in the English language, which is why there is a Penguin edition of their works which I'm holding in my hand, and which I highly recommend. As for Johnson, I suppose, in choosing to appeal, at least initially, a little more to the lettered and less to the rabblement, his charitable critics would have noted his brilliance but chided his self-indulgence. The less charitable ones might have mocked his literary snobbishness and preciosity. But of course, in characteristic defiance, he opened one of his earlier essays titled The Rambler and His Critics with this: that every man should regulate his actions by his own conscience without any regard to the opinions of the rest of the world is one of the first precepts of moral prudence. Like the rest of us though, he wasn't completely insensitive to bad reviews, especially when his essays weren't selling well. But once his reputation as a wit and dazzling conversationalist began spreading among the salons and taverns and literary societies of London, it must have been difficult not to shove this in the faces of those same critics. But I suppose harbouring grudges is a waste of energy, and braggadocio beneath a man of his dignity. And this is evident in the last passage of that same essay, where he writes, with equanimity and sober defiance, "Had the opinion of my censures been unanimous, it might have overset my resolution, but since I find them at variance with each other, I can without scruple neglect them, and endeavour to gain favour of the public by following the direction of my own reason, and indulging the sallies of my own imagination." And he was right to do so. By the time he was contributing to the Idler, he was already Dictionary Johnson, one of the most famous scholars in Europe. He had James Boswell following him around, recording his every remark as if he were Jesus or Socrates, for a biography that would ultimately outstrip the dictionary in fame, reserving for our future benefit and entertainment snatches of a mind and soul long dead and buried, which still catches us off guard when we read what he wrote and what he said. And that being said, let's get to this essay. Okay, so this is from the Idler, number 88, Saturday, December the 22nd, 1759, The Limitations of Human Achievement. Some editions have the title, What Have You Done? From the epigraph by Pliny the Elder, Hodie quid egesti, What have you done today? When the philosophers of the last age were first congregated into the Royal Society, great expectations were raised of the sudden progress of the useful arts. The time was supposed to be near, when engines should turn by a perpetual motion, and health be secured by the universal medicine, when learning should be facilitated by a real character, and commerce extended by ships which could reach their ports in defiance of the tempest. But improvement is naturally slow. The society met and parted without any visible diminution of the miseries of life. The gout and stone were still painful. The ground that was not ploughed brought no harvest, and neither oranges nor grapes would grow upon the hawthorn. At last, those who were disappointed began to be angry. Those likewise who hated innovation were glad to gain an opportunity of ridiculing men who had depreciated, perhaps with too much arrogance, the knowledge of antiquity. And it appears from some of their earliest apologies that philosophers felt with great sensibility the unwelcome importunities of those who are daily asking, "What have you done?" The truth is that little had been done compared to what fame had been suffered to promise, and the question could only be answered by general apologies and by new hopes, which, when they were frustrated, gave a new occasion to the same vexatious inquiry. The fatal question has disturbed the quiet of many other minds. He that in the latter part of his life too strictly inquires what he has done can very seldom receive from his own heart such an account as will give him satisfaction. We do not, indeed, so often disappoint others as ourselves. We not only think more highly than others of our own abilities, but allow ourselves to form hopes which we never communicate, and please our thoughts with employments which none ever will allot us, with elevations to which we are never expected to rise. And when our days and years have passed away in common business or common amusements, and we find at last that we have suffered our purposes to sleep till the time of action is past, we are reproached only by our own reflections. Neither our friends nor our enemies wonder that we live and die like the rest of mankind, that we live without notice and die without memorial. They know not what task we have proposed, and therefore cannot discern whether it is finished. He that compares what he has done with what he has left undone will feel the effect which must always follow the comparison of imagination with reality. He will look with contempt on his own unimportance, and wonder to what purpose he came into the world. He will repine that he shall leave behind him no evidence of his having been, that he has added nothing to the system of life, but has glided from youth to age among the crowd, without any effort for distinction. Man is seldom willing to let fall the opinion of his own dignity, or to believe that he does little, only because every individual is a very little being. He is better content to want diligence than power, and sooner confesses the depravity of his will than the imbecility of his nature. From this mistaken notion of human greatness, it proceeds that many who pretend to have made great advances in wisdom so loudly declare that they despise themselves. If I had ever found any of the self-contemners much irritated or pained by the consciousness of their meanness, I should have given them consolation by observing that a little more than nothing is as much as can be expected from a being who, with respect to the multitudes about him, is himself little more than nothing. Every man is obliged by the Supreme Master of the universe to improve all the opportunities of good which are afforded him, and to keep in continual activity such abilities as are bestowed upon him. But he has no reason to repine, though his abilities are small and his opportunities few. He that has improved the virtue or advanced the happiness of one fellow creature, he that has ascertained a single moral proposition or added one useful experiment to natural knowledge, may be contented with his own performance, and with respect to mortals like himself, may demand, like Augustus, to be dismissed at his departure with applause. So there it is. I said it would be short. In this Oxford World Classics edition, it's less than 2 pages. It's not the greatest essay he's written, but like most of his essays, can be read in one sitting, and in this particular case can be read before the seat's even warm, which is a good thing, because if its purpose is to serve as a spur to prick the sides of our intent, to quote Macbeth, to remind us that life is short and opportunities few, the reading should feel like a spur and not a sermon. Anyway, he begins by alluding to the great expectations that were raised by the sudden progress of the useful arts. By useful arts, of course, he doesn't mean sculpture or painting or poetry. He means the steam engine. He means Harrison's chronometer, which solved the problem of longitude. He means the East India Company and global commerce. The reflecting telescope even, developed by Newton not long before the chronometer. He means the use of recent developments in maths and physics to predict eclipses and the passage of comets, or another recent invention, the microscope, to observe what they used to call animalcules, creatures invisible to the naked eye, which no human being before the 17th century knew even existed, because this was the start of the Industrial Revolution. And while we're often frustrated by how slowly these things seem to progress in the course of a single human lifetime, in times of revolution they appear to pick up pace, especially while we're young, before disenchantment sets in. The fact is that great rebirths and ages of reason rarely affect a common man or woman. They may promise much in the beginning, but at the end of the day the gout is still painful and the common cold still prevalent. And as we grow old, we resent the early optimism we had and pour ridicule upon the young among us who exhibit the same tendencies. And before we know it, we've transformed into the very opposite of what we were, becoming among those who hate innovation, who are glad to gain an opportunity of ridiculing those who depreciated, perhaps with too much arrogance, the knowledge of antiquity. The young are cursed to hope, the old to regret. Johnson then moves from the universal to the particular, and this is where you know he's speaking about himself, and of that self-reproach I alluded to earlier. He says, "He that in the latter part of his life too strictly inquires what he has done, will very seldom receive from his own heart such an account as will give him satisfaction." Johnson had just turned 51 when he wrote this. Not so old if you're 40, not so young if you're 30, and positively ancient if you're 20. He would go on to live another 25 years, but he was often afflicted with poor health, with depression, and he wasn't the most prepossessing of people. His enemies would have taken relish to remark upon his obesity, his lazy eye, his awkward tic, which may or may not have been Tourette's. It seemed remarkable that such a man would enrapture a whole room once he began speaking, or would head a club that included such Enlightenment notables as Joshua Reynolds, Edmund Burke, Oliver Goldsmith, and James Boswell, of course, among others. Nevertheless, he thought, having just turned 51, the majority of his life likely behind him, the best years of his life, most certainly, perhaps there was only decline and senility to look forward to. What would we, in centuries to come, judge of his accomplishments? Would we say he lived without notice, died without memorial? Would we say he left behind him no evidence of his having been? Remember, he was already Dr. Johnson, Dictionary Johnson by this time, and he was buried in the Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey, so his contemporaries would have demurred at the suggestion. Still, the fear preoccupied him, and especially when the megrims struck, the depression that so often afflicted him and reduced his productivity to nil. And as each day passed, with nothing written, nothing read, the reproaches grew louder, if not from himself, then from the supreme master of the universe, whoever that is, not a character in He-Man, but the God of the deists, the first cause, the prime mover, whose injunction that we should keep in continual activity such abilities as are bestowed upon us, be taken not just as an imperative, but as a law of nature. Perhaps we should learn to be content with smaller accomplishments. Old men don't like revolutions. Maybe the small victories will, taken in the aggregate, be regarded by those who surround our deathbeds as worthy of applause. The reference to Augustus being applauded as he died, taken from the Roman historian Suetonius, can seem to us melodramatic, even histrionic, to treat any politician thus, especially in the 21st century. But in Johnson's day, Augustus's life was exemplary. Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire only reinforced this. And the idea that one can be applauded out of life, as if exiting a stage, makes me think Shakespeare was aware of the same anecdote, the same reference in Suetonius, when he famously wrote, "All the world's a stage, and the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts." And if his acts are 7 ages, then I suppose Johnson would have regarded himself as being like the Justice, in fair round belly with good capon lined, with eyes severe and a beard of formal cut, although he never had a beard, full of wise saws and modern instances. And so he plays his part, full of wise saws indeed. I suppose if there's a lesson in there somewhere for those of us who make New Year's resolutions, it's to make them attainable, and not to be too hard on ourselves if we fail. As Samuel Beckett wrote, "Ever tried, ever failed. Try again, fail again, fail better." Hope you join me next month when I'll be discussing depictions of the human body in art, from antiquity to the present. Happy New Year.